Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a pretty fascinating plunge,
Oh,
actually.
yeah.
We're looking into what might seem like two totally different worlds, UFO phenomena on one hand
Mm-hmm.
and biblical theology on the other. You know, the study of the Bible's core ideas.
Right. Doctrines, teachings.
Exactly. And we've got this really interesting material, mainly from a documentary called Aliens and Demons, Evidence of an Unseen Realm.
Featuring Dr. Michael S. Heiser.
Yeah, a biblical scholar.
Yes.
So our mission today is basically to unpack the connections, some surprising, maybe even mind-bending connections between these two areas.
Absolutely. And, right off the bat, what's really striking is Dr. Heiser himself.
Yeah.
I mean, here you have a well-respected biblical scholar, and he actually attends and speaks at UFO conferences.
Which sounds unusual, maybe.
It does. And you might wonder, why? Why would he do that? But his thinking is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's the sheer scale of interest. Think about shows like Ancient Aliens. Millions of people watch that stuff.
Right, it's huge.
So for a biblical scholar like Heiser, that huge audience suggests people are wrestling with some really big fundamental questions.
Questions
Like, where did we come from? What's it mean to be human? And the big one for a lot of people.
God.
Exactly. What about God? Is the God of the Bible the ultimate creator, or could there be something else? Something more advanced, maybe even extraterrestrial?
Okay, so that's the intersection he sees.
Precisely. A real overlap between the whole UFO discussion and what the Bible talks about, the unseen world, angels, demons, God himself. He thinks it's connected.
In surprising ways, you said.
Definitely. And it taps into something, really deep in people, doesn't it? This search for truth.
Yeah, wanting answers.
People want to know their place in the universe, and if ancient texts, like the Bible, still mean anything when we're faced with these weird modern mysteries.
Absolutely. And I guess the first question that pops into most people's heads is pretty simple. Are UFOs real?
Right. Though Heiser points out when people ask that, they usually mean something more specific.
Like, are there aliens flying spaceships around?
Exactly. That's the core of the public fascination, isn't it?
Yeah. So what's Heiser's answer to that initial question?
Well, his short answer is pretty direct.
Yeah.
Yes, there are lots of legitimate UFO sightings.
Okay, but he's not jumping straight to little green men.
No, not immediately. When he says legitimate, he means unidentified objects, things seen in the sky, reported by, well, everyone, regular folks, but also trained observers.
Pilots, military.
Yeah, pilots, military personnel. He mentions thousands of these reports just in the U.S. every year, so it's not some, fringe thing.
Okay, but it goes beyond just seeing a light you can't identify.
Oh, yeah. Heiser talks about genuine anomalies, objects doing things that they defy our physics, how we think things should fly.
Like what?
Well, things changing shape, right, in midair. Or even reports of objects seeming to, explode and then pull themselves back together.
Whoa. Okay, that's definitely beyond misidentifying a weather balloon or something.
Right. And it's those kinds of really unexplainable events, he says, that often trigger something deeper in people.
A shift.
Yeah, a shift from just what did I see to more spiritual questions. When you encounter something that just completely shakes up your reality.
It makes you think bigger.
Exactly. About existence itself. And those questions often lead back to religion, theology, old sacred texts.
It's interesting, though, for someone so deep in biblical scholarship, he calls UFOs his hobby.
Yeah, it's like his way of exploring these fundamental questions, but through a, let's say, unconventional lens.
Which, as you said, isn't the typical approach you'd find in, say, many Christian communities.
Definitely not. Heiser mentions that the usual reaction he sees is dismissal. Like if someone reports a UFO experience, they might be told, oh, you need therapy or counseling or maybe even...
An exorcism.
Yeah, sometimes even that.
But Heiser's found something different at these UFO conferences.
Quite different, yeah. He says he's had some really significant theological discussions there. Sometimes, he says, better than in church. He even gives an example of a church in Puerto Rico where apparently most of the congregation claims to have had alien abduction experiences.
Seriously?
Yeah, people of faith trying to figure out how these experiences fit with what they believe.
So, okay, it really comes down to this central question then, doesn't it?
Which is?
If this UFO stuff, these alien phenomena, if they are real in some sense, how does that affect our understanding of the Bible, of Christian faith?
That's the core issue, yeah. It really forces you to think.
Okay, let's dig into that a bit. Heiser points to a specific moment, right? Roswell, 1997, the conference.
Yeah, that seemed to be a real turning point for him. He'd done his research, obviously, but there was this Air Force debriefing on CNN.
What happened there?
Well, a reporter asked this Colonel Haynes about the bodies, the alleged alien bodies from the Roswell crash.
Right. The official line became crash test dummies, didn't it?
It did. But the reporter pointed out let's say, slight problem with that.
Which?
The Air Force's own report said those kinds of dummies weren't even used until the early 1950s.
And Roswell was 1947.
Exactly. Years earlier.
So how did the colonel explain that discrepancy?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. He claimed the witnesses must have experienced time compression.
Time compression? What does that even mean?
Apparently that they were somehow misremembering an event from the 50s, but thinking it happened in 47?
Wait, seriously? Hundreds of witnesses, their families, the news reports from 1947, all just misremembering.
That was the explanation offered.
Wow, okay. I can see why Heiser found that hard to swallow.
Right. It stretches credibility pretty thin, doesn't it? Heiser's take was, look, this explanation is so weak, it almost feels deliberate.
Deliberately weak? How so?
Like maybe someone wanted the alien cover-up story to persist. Because the official story made so little sense, it just fueled the conspiracy theories more.
So the alien story was almost convenient.
That seems to be his conclusion. It served as a kind of misdirection.
Okay, so if it wasn't aliens and the weather balloon story evolved, what does Heiser think happened? He mentioned documents.
Yeah, he says there are genuine documents referring to Roswell. And they suggest it wasn't extraterrestrial.
But also not just a weather balloon.
Right, something in between. Which leads to those majestic documents.
The controversial ones.
Very controversial.
Yeah.
Heiser admits their origin is super shady. Microfilm sent anonymously. A lot of people think they're fakes or partly faked.
But he finds something interesting in them.
He does. Because they seem to blend descriptions of, like, known tech from that WWII early Cold War era.
Advanced stuff.
Some really advanced stuff, yeah. Rumored Nazi German tech. Even things like photochemical processing for nuclear material. Really cutting edge for the time. They blend that with the Roswell story.
Okay, so where does that lead him? What's his theory?
Heiser suggests it might have been an Operation Paperclip screw-up.
Operation Paperclip. That was bringing the Nazi scientists to the U.S. after the war, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Secret program. Truman wasn't keen on bringing over potential war criminals, apparently.
Understandable.
But others felt the scientific knowledge was too valuable to pass up. So they created this paperclip system to sort of bypass the normal vetting for the scientists they really wanted, even if they had difficult pasts.
How many did they bring over?
Over 700 in the end. Big names, too, like Wernher von Braun.
The rocket scientist. Later worked for NASA, Disney.
That's the one. And here's the connection Heiser makes.
Okay.
Those German scientists were working on some pretty advanced aircraft designs. Wingless, delta-shaped craft.
Delta-shaped, like triangles.
Yeah, and think about the early UFO reports. Kenneth Arnold, the guy who coined flying saucer.
Yeah.
He described the movement like saucers skipping on water. But when he drew what he saw, it was more like a delta wing shape, not a classic round saucer.
Huh. Interesting. And Roswell debris descriptions were weird, too. Mundane stuff mixed with exotic.
Right, like finding regular gears alongside materials described as totally alien. It's inconsistent.
So, connect the dots. Paperclip, delta wings, Roswell. What's the potential link?
Think about 1947. The war just ended. Imagine the public reaction if people found out the U.S. was secretly employing hundreds of ex-Nazi scientists.
Especially at a place like Roswell, which was a nuclear base.
A total PR nightmare, right?
Yeah.
Heiser suggests the alien story, or letting the alien story run, was a perfect cover.
A misdirection to hide the paperclip connection?
Potentially. To explain away a crash of maybe some experimental craft,
Yeah.
possibly related to that German tech, without revealing the scientists involved.
Okay, but what about the bodies? That's the persistent part of the Roswell story. If not aliens, then what?
This is where Heiser's theory gets really dark.
How so?
He speculates they might have been human subjects, maybe young children, possibly even some with genetic conditions like progeria, which can give a superficially alien appearance.
Oh, wow.
Or maybe, he suggests, young adults taken from prisons for experiment.
Human experiments, like...
He connects it to the Japanese side of Paperclip. Horrific stuff. Operation Fugo, the balloon bombs.
I've heard of those. High-altitude balloons meant to carry weapons.
Biological weapons, yeah. And Unit 731. Unspeakable human experiments there. Some Fugo balloons actually reached the U.S., but it was hushed up.
And the U.S. brought over Japanese scientists involved in that, too.
They did, under Paperclip, which, Heiser suggests, led to similar kinds of ethically awful experiments here. high-altitude medical tests on people, even death row inmates in something called Project Sunshine.
This is disturbing.
It really is. So Heiser's hypothesis is maybe Roswell was a terrible accident involving one of these high-altitude balloon experiments with human subjects.
And the cover story. Weather balloon, Russian tech, or aliens. All better than admitting that.
That seems to be the idea. A convenient way to hide something potentially very ugly.
Okay. Wow. Let's shift gears a bit to the contactee movement, alien abductions.
Right. Another really strange, complex area. People claiming direct encounters, being taken aboard ships.
And there are different ways people try to explain these, aren't there?
Oh, yeah. Some look for purely human causes, brainwashing, maybe trauma creating false memories, abuse, even links to mind control programs like MK Ultra.
MK Ultra again.
Heiser mentions it. Apparently, there's some overlap in names found in declassified MK Ultra documents and names that pop up in alien abduction stories.
Oh.
MK also started as truth serum research, but they stumble onto how trauma can cause dissociation, maybe even allow for programming someone's mind. It's unsettling stuff.
Very. But Heiser's perspective goes beyond just human causes, right?
Yeah.
Given his background.
It does. He uses strong words like wicked and evil when talking about the contactee phenomenon, suggesting deliberate abuse is often involved.
But it's complex.
Yeah, he acknowledges that. He mentions John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who studied abductees. Mack saw parallels to shamanistic experiences, even Stockholm Syndrome.
Stockholm Syndrome, like identifying with your captors.
Yeah, feeling chosen, special, even developing a bond.
And there's often a message involved in these encounters, isn't there?
A key element, usually some kind of message for humankind about Earth's destiny, evolution, that sort of thing.
But Heiser flags something specific about these messages.
He does. From his theological viewpoint, what stands out is how consistently anti-Christian they often are.
How so?
The figure of Jesus is often downplayed. He's presented as just a normal human, maybe an advanced teacher, or even just another alien like them.
Which goes against basic Christian beliefs about who Jesus is.
Exactly. It directly subverts Christian theology.
Oh.
And interestingly, Heiser notes, other religions often don't get targeted in the same way in these messages.
And it's not just Heiser noticing this pattern.
No. He mentions Jacques Vallée, a very famous UFO researcher, not a Christian, who also pointed out this sort of spiritually sinister vibe to the messaging in contact cases.
And there was that MIT conference on abductions.
Yeah, back in 1992. Heiser, there were papers presented there exploring similarities between abduction stories and satanic ritual abuse narratives.
Whoa. What kind of similarity?
Things like being put on metal tables, specific types of wounds or probings, the messaging. Even talk about creating hybrid children.
Hybrid children?
Yeah. In SRA context, perpetrators might impersonate religious figures to traumatize victims, invert their faith. There's a parallel in abductions with the chosen one message, sometimes framed as shamanistic, but also this hybrid narrative.
Tell me more about the hybrid narrative.
Women sometimes come away believing they're carrying a hybrid child, often described in ways that, to a Christian, might sound antichrist-like, but it's presented positively, like this is the next step in human evolution.
So how does Heiser interpret this if he doubts actual aliens are doing it?
He thinks these narratives might be masking real abuse, or they reflect the kind of messaging people are given during whatever traumatic event is happening.
Could it be directly demonic? A spiritual attack interpreted through an alien filter?
Heiser certainly leaves that door open. That some experiences might be straight-up spiritual attacks, interpreted using the available cultural symbols, in this case, aliens.
And what about people stopping abductions by calling on Jesus' name?
Exactly. Heiser points to those accounts too. If invoking Jesus stops it, that strongly suggests a spiritual, likely demonic element, doesn't it?
It does seem to point that way. And these things run in families sometimes. Or repeat.
Yeah, those patterns also suggest something beyond just random, isolated events.
Can you give an example, a specific contactee Heiser discusses?
Sure. George Adamski, famous guy from the 50s, claimed contact with Venusians.
Venusians, okay. What was his message?
Heiser calls it warmed over Gnosticism.
Gnosticism, that ancient belief system.
Right, the idea that humans have this inner spark, this light of God, and salvation comes through enlightenment, realizing your own divinity.
Yeah.
Self-salvation, basically.
And Gnosticism was a rival to early Christianity.
A major one. Often flipped the biblical narrative, made the biblical God seem like the bad guy, and the serpent in the garden, the hero bringing knowledge. Adamski's message echoed those themes.
Okay. Any other examples?
Billy Meyer, the Swiss contactee with all the alleged photos of UFOs. Meyer's main alien contact was female, named Semjasa.
Semjasi.
Yeah, and Heiser points out the striking phonetic similarity to Shemihaza, or Shemkaza,
Which is?
a name from the book of 1 Enoch, a demonic figure, a leader of the fallen angels, the Watchers from Genesis 6.
Wow, so that's either a deliberate choice by Meyer, if he made it up.
Or, if you entertain the spiritual angle, maybe a sinister entity deliberately using a name with those connotations. It's suggestive, either way.
So the common thread in these contactee stories.
There's often this idea of gods or spiritual beings lifting up a special group, elites, for civilization or maybe creating hybrids, leading to human transcendence.
Which contrasts sharply with the Christian view of Jesus being unique for salvation.
Completely different path, yeah.
Okay, let's shift again. Ancient Aliens. That show is everywhere.
Massively popular. Heiser notes its approach truth by anomaly, finding weird stuff in the past and saying, see, aliens, and they pull the Bible into it as just another ancient text.
How does Heiser respond to their claims, especially about human origins?
He's pretty blunt. He calls their claims about aliens creating or modifying humans lies.
Strong word. He focuses on Zecharia Sitchin, right?
Yeah, Sitchin was huge in popularizing these ideas. Claimed he was an expert in ancient languages, Sumerian tablets.
And his big theory was
The Anunnaki, extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru. He said they created us, or tweaked our genes.
But Heiser debunks this.
Thoroughly. He says, look at the actual Sumerian texts. There's no tablet that says the Anunnaki are from Nibiru.
No. What is Nibiru in the text?
It's usually associated with Jupiter or Mercury, or sometimes just a star, not some hidden planet. And there's zero mention of Anunnaki flying in spaceships.
So Sitchin's core ideas just aren't in the texts he claimed to read.
According to Heiser and other actual scholars of those languages, no. The textual basis isn't there.
Okay. What about Genesis 6? That's a big one for ancient alien theorists, isn't it?
Huge. Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4, talks about the sons of God and the daughters of men.
And the Nephilim?
Right. The ancient aliens' interpretation is sons of God, extraterrestrials. They interbred with human women, created the Nephilim.
Who they see as giants, or maybe the master builders of pyramids and stuff.
Exactly. The great civilizers. That's their explanation for megalithic structures.
But what's the traditional biblical understanding?
Very different. Sons of God are usually understood as spiritual beings,
Yeah.
angels, who somehow took physical form.
And cohabited with human women.
Yes. Producing the Nephilim, traditionally seen as literal giants, it's viewed as a transgression, not aliens needing to reproduce like us.
Heiser brings in Mesopotamian context, too.
Crucial context, yeah. He talks about the Apkallu myths,
Hapkalu.
sort of divine sages, demigods who helped humans build civilization in Mesopotamian stories. The myth goes the high gods planned a flood, so the Apkallu mated with humans to create super smart offspring to preserve knowledge. But the Apkallu got punished for it.
And Genesis 6?
Heiser argues Genesis 6 is like an inversion, a polemic against that Mesopotamian view. It presents the union not as heroic, but as a terrible transgression. Divine and human rebellion crossing boundaries God set up.
Leading to bad things.
Yeah, violence, lust, forbidden knowledge, like astrology. Negative consequences.
So summing up the traditional supernatural view of Genesis
It's
6.
about divine beings, likely fallen angels, taking bodies, creating their own lineage, the Nephilim, the giants. This explains the giant clans Israel encounters later.
And maybe links the spirits of those Nephilim to demons later on.
That's a common theological connection made. Yeah, they're disembodied spirits.
Okay. Now, what about the simple objection? The Bible doesn't mention aliens, so they can't exist.
Yeah, the argument from silence.
Mm-hmm.
Heiser dismisses that pretty quickly. He basically says the Bible doesn't mention lots of real things.
Mm-hmm.
Cars, microwaves, toilet paper. Just because it's not mentioned doesn't prove it doesn't exist. The Bible isn't an exhaustive list of everything in creation.
Makes sense. What about the image of God issue? If aliens exist, are humans no longer special or unique?
That's a common concern. But Heiser argues against tying the image of God just to intelligence or any single quality like that.
So how does he interpret being made in God's image? Genesis 1.
He looks closely at Genesis 1.26:27. God says, "Let us create man in our image," plural.
Who's the us?
Heiser suggests God is addressing the heavenly host, the pre-existing spiritual beings, the sons of God from Job 38 who were there at creation. It's like God is announcing his plan to his council.
Okay.
But then the text says, so God created man in his own image. Singular.
So the act of creation is God alone.
Exactly. Humans image God in the physical realm. The spiritual beings image God in the spiritual realm. Both are imagers, but only God creates.
So if intelligent ETs exist,
They'd be created beings, part of God's creation, but they wouldn't be part of that specific Genesis 1 discussion about humanity imaging God on earth or being the heavenly host. They'd be something else God made.
and God doesn't have to tell us about everything he's made.
Precisely. The Bible's focus is God's relationship with us, his plan for humanity and earth.
So ultimately, Heiser seems less concerned with proving or disproving nuts and bolts aliens.
Yeah, he shifts the focus more towards the messaging, the spiritual implications.
What does he see as the goal there?
He talks about intelligent evil, potentially trying to control the language of spirituality
Oh.
by redefining everything. God, Jesus, humanity's sin, salvation, destiny, even heaven. Redefining it all within an extraterrestrial framework, taking the familiar words but changing the meaning.
He had that analogy about science fiction.
Yeah, like sci-fi can sometimes act as televangelism for the alien worldview. It uses religious-sounding language transcendence, salvation, but gives it an ET spin.
Kind of like the serpent in the garden twisting God's words.
He draws that parallel exactly. Misleading Eve by subtly reinterpreting what God actually said.
And the dangerous.
Embracing a different Christ, a non-gospel.
Yeah.
Accepting something that sounds familiar but has had its core theological meaning hollowed out and replaced by an alien narrative.
So wrapping this up, it's a really strange mix we've been discussing. Biblical theology, the unseen world, UFOs, abductions.
It really is. And Heiser's point seems to be we need to process this strange mixture, honestly.
Don't just dismiss it, but don't just accept it uncritically either.
Right. Acknowledge the world is probably stranger than we often think. Science hasn't explained everything. Maybe it can't. There is a spiritual dimension. There are anomalies.
So embrace the strangeness, but be critical.
Engage with it open-mindedly, but process the claims, the experiences, honestly and with discernment.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps.
Yeah.
How does that deep human longing we all have for meaning, for transcendence, for something more, how might that very real desire play into all of this? How could it be maybe manipulated or misinterpreted when we encounter things we just can't easily explain?
That's a really provocative question to end on, isn't it? Definitely something for listeners to chew on.